There may have been a time when the entire future of humanity could have vanished without leaving anyone behind to remember that we had ever existed. Not in a single afternoon, not beneath a falling asteroid, not under the shadow of one enormous volcanic eruption, but slowly, quietly, across thousands upon thousands of ordinary mornings. Almost 1 million years ago, long before Homo sapiens walked the earth, our distant ancestors lived in a world that was becoming increasingly difficult to predict. Glacial cycles were intensifying, temperatures shifted, rainfall patterns changed, forests withdrew from some regions while grasslands expanded across others. Lakes appeared, shrank, and sometimes disappeared. Rivers changed course. Animal herds moved toward unfamiliar ground. And the ancient human populations living among these changing landscapes had no reserves to protect them. No farms, no stored grain, no permanent cities, no medicine, no maps showing where water might still be found. For a small community of early humans, survival depended upon the landscape immediately around them. A spring that continued flowing, a stand of edible plants, animals passing through at the right season, stones suitable for making a sharp edge, enough firewood to carry a flame through the night. When those things disappeared, people had only a few choices. Adapt, move, or die. In 2023, a genetic study using a method called FitCoal proposed something extraordinary. By examining patterns preserved inside the genomes of modern humans, researchers estimated that an ancestral human population may have passed through an extremely severe population bottleneck between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. The estimated effective breeding population fell to approximately 1,280 individuals. That number does not mean that exactly 1,280 human beings remained alive on the entire planet. Effective population size is a genetic concept. It describes, in simplified terms, the number of individuals contributing genes to future generations. The actual number of living people may have been considerably larger. Even so, if the estimate is broadly correct, the decline was profound. And it may have lasted for more than 100,000 years. Imagine that scale of time. Civilizations rise and disappear within a few thousand years. Recorded history occupies only a thin layer of the human story. But this possible bottleneck may have continued through thousands of generations, each one living without any knowledge that the continuation of an ancient lineage depended upon children surviving long enough to have children of their own. Yet the mystery remains unresolved. Other genetic approaches have questioned whether such an extreme bottleneck truly occurred. A later method, known as FLASH, found much weaker evidence for a collapse of the same magnitude. Researchers using FitCoal have continued to defend their interpretation. The scientific debate remains open, and that uncertainty makes the story more compelling, not less. Because somewhere inside our DNA, our fossils, our stone tools, and the changing sediments of ancient landscapes lies evidence of a difficult period that we still do not completely understand. Over the next 8 chapters, we will enter that lost world. We will follow shrinking lakes beneath pale Pleistocene skies. We will imagine small groups moving through unfamiliar valleys in search of water. We will explore what genetic bottlenecks really mean, why scientists disagree about them, and how climate may have divided ancient populations into isolated refugees. We will consider fire, food, stone tools, migration, cooperation, memory, and luck. And most of all, we will follow the thousands of generations whose names will never be known. People who never imagined cities, never imagined writing, never imagined spacecraft crossing the darkness above the atmosphere. They knew only the people beside them, the landscape ahead of them, the warmth of a small fire, and the uncertainty of another morning. They were not trying to save humanity. They were simply trying to survive. And somehow, generation after generation, the chain remained unbroken, until eventually it reached us. If you had been standing in Africa roughly 900,000 years ago, you would not have known that anything extraordinary was happening. There would have been no warning in the sky, no line of fire crossing the horizon, no single earthquake announcing the beginning of a crisis. Morning would have arrived as it always had. The darkness would have softened. The eastern sky would have become pale. Birds would have begun calling from the trees and reeds. Mist might have rested above a lake or gathered in a shallow valley. Far away, grazing animals would have moved slowly across the open ground, their bodies dark against the first light. Somewhere nearby, a predator might have been returning from the night, and in one small place, among rocks, trees, or the edge of a watercourse, a group of ancient humans would have begun to wake. They were not Homo sapiens. Our species would not appear for hundreds of thousands of years. These were much older populations of the genus Homo, distant ancestors and relatives living deep within the branching history that would eventually produce later human lineages. They had no word for Pleistocene. They had no concept of prehistory. They did not know that continents had moved, that ice sheets expanded and retreated, or that the planet beneath their feet was part of a vast system of changing climate. They simply woke into the world they knew. A child stirred beside an adult. Someone checked the remains of a fire, if fire had been maintained through the night. Someone picked up a piece of stone whose cutting edge had become dull. Someone looked toward the water. Hunger was already present. So was thirst. The day had begun. And this is where the title of our story becomes misleading. The day humanity almost disappeared. It sounds like an event, a date that could be marked on a calendar, a sudden moment when the future narrowed to almost nothing. But if the severe population bottleneck proposed by some genetic researchers truly occurred, there was probably no single day when humanity nearly vanished. There may instead have been tens of thousands of years during which ancient human populations remained dangerously small. The crisis would not have felt like one crisis. It would have felt like life, a difficult season, then another, a dry year, then several wetter years, a familiar spring producing less water, a herd arriving later than usual, a winter colder than the one remembered before it, a child who did not survive an illness, an adult injured far from shelter, a woman dying during childbirth, an old source of food becoming unreliable, a neighboring group that had once been encountered every few seasons simply failing to appear again. Nothing, by itself, would have announced extinction. That is often how disappearance happens in nature, quietly, one local loss at a time. Imagine a group of perhaps a few dozen individuals living near a lake. For many years, the lake is dependable. Animals come there to drink. Plants grow along its margins. Birds gather in the shallows. The people know the paths surrounding it. They know which stones can be broken into useful shapes. They know which roots can be dug from damp ground. Children learn the landscape before they are old enough to travel far from the adults. Then the rainfall changes, not dramatically at first. The lake remains, but its shoreline begins to retreat. The reeds thin. Some animals move elsewhere. The people walk farther to reach water. A year later, perhaps the rains return. The danger seems to pass. Then the dry seasons lengthen again. Over several generations, the old landscape begins to lose its reliability. This would not necessarily kill everyone. That distinction is important. Human populations do not need to vanish completely for a genetic bottleneck to occur. They only need to become much smaller, more isolated, or less successful at producing descendants who contribute to future generations. Some groups may survive while others disappear. Some may remain isolated for long periods. Some may merge. Some may move hundreds of kilometers over generations. Some may leave no descendants at all. From the viewpoint of the people living through it, there is no grand pattern. Only journeys, births, deaths, departures, meetings, seasons. But from the viewpoint of genetics, hundreds of thousands of years later, these countless small events may leave a signature. And that brings us to one of the strangest possibilities in the entire human story. The evidence for an ancient demographic crisis does not come from a written record. It does not come from a monument. It does not come from a grave containing the names of the dead. It may be hidden inside people who are alive today. Inside you. Inside me. Inside billions of humans whose genomes contain fragments of a past that no one consciously remembers. To understand this, imagine a family tree. At the lowest branches are people alive in the present. Their parents are above them. Then grandparents. Then great-grandparents. As we travel backward, the number of theoretical ancestors seems to grow rapidly. But real ancestry does not form a perfect tree. Branches repeatedly reconnect. Distant relatives share ancestors. Populations mix. Some lineages disappear. Others become extremely common. Geneticists study patterns created by these relationships. They examine variation across genomes. They compare how different genetic lineages appear to have separated and rejoined through time. Using mathematical models, they attempt to estimate how large ancestral populations may have been at different moments in the past. This is not the same as finding an ancient census. There was no census. No one counted the inhabitants of Africa 900,000 years ago. The numbers are reconstructions. They depend on assumptions about mutation rates, generations, population structure, and the behavior of genetic lineages through time. Different methods can produce different histories. That is why the scientific debate matters. In 2023, researchers using a method called FitCoal analyzed genomic information from thousands of modern humans and proposed an extraordinary decline in ancestral effective population size. According to their model, the population contributing to later human ancestry may have fallen to an average effective size of approximately 1,280 breeding individuals between about 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. Those numbers immediately captured attention. 1,280. It is small enough to imagine. That may be part of what makes it so haunting. A modern theater can hold more people. A large school can contain nearly as many. A single residential neighborhood may exceed it several times over. But the comparison can also mislead us. Effective population size is not the same as the total number of individuals alive. There could have been many more actual humans spread across different landscapes. Some may have belonged to populations that later disappeared completely. Some may not have contributed equally to future generations. Some groups may have been geographically separated. The genetic number is therefore not a literal head count. Still, if the model is correct, it points towards something severe. A long period in which the ancestral population relevant to later humans became dramatically restricted, and the duration may be more remarkable than the minimum size. More than 100,000 years. Our minds are poorly designed for such distances of time. Consider how long 100 years feels. For an individual human life, it is enormous. Now multiply that by 10. 1,000 years. Empires can rise and fall. Languages can transform. Religions can spread across continents. Borders can vanish. Now multiply again. 10,000 years. Agriculture appears. Cities emerge. Written history begins. Civilizations fill entire landscapes. And even 10,000 years represents only a fraction of the possible duration of this ancient bottleneck. If the proposed interval is broadly correct, ancient populations may have lived under restricted demographic conditions for a span longer than all recorded human civilization many times over. There would have been no single generation that understood this. No grandmother could say that the crisis had begun before her childhood, because it had already existed long before the oldest story anyone could remember. No child could grow up waiting for the ancient hardship to end. To them, the difficult world was simply the world. That thought changes the emotional shape of near extinction. Modern people often imagine survival through dramatic moments. A flood arrives. A fire begins. A storm crosses the coast. The danger rises sharply, reaches a peak, and then passes. Those crises are terrifying precisely because they are sudden. But a population can also be tested by conditions that do not pass within a lifetime. Imagine being born into a dry period. Your parents remember similar dryness. Their parents did too. You grow older. You teach children where water can still be found. Those children grow old and teach the same knowledge to their own descendants. By the time conditions change significantly, no one remembers the world before. Survival becomes not an act of emergency, but a culture of adaptation. This may be closer to the reality faced by many Pleistocene populations. Climate was never entirely stable. Rainfall changed. Vegetation shifted. Cold phases intensified. Habitats expanded and contracted. Large animals moved with the seasons and with long-term ecological changes. What humans could eat, where they could sleep, and where they could safely travel depended on a landscape that was always moving on scales both short and immense. One group might prosper for several generations near a river. Then sediment changes the channel. Another group might follow grazing animals into a new region. Another might remain trapped between expanding dry zones. Another might reach a refuge where water and vegetation persisted, even while surrounding areas became less hospitable. And one group somewhere might fail. There would be no funeral for the population, no final witness standing on a hill. Perhaps there would simply be fewer people one year, then fewer again. A child born into a group of 30 might grow up in a group of 20. An injury removes another hunter. A disease takes 2 children. The next rains fail. Several people leave in search of relatives. They never return. Soon the camp is abandoned. Wind crosses the place where people once slept. Ash from an old fire mixes with dust. Stone flakes remain on the ground. And thousands of years later, even those traces may disappear beneath sediment. This is one of the difficulties of studying deep human history. The archaeological record is not a complete archive. It is a scattering, a tiny fraction of what once existed. Stone survives well. Bone sometimes survives. Wood usually does not. Plant fibers rarely do. Footprints can vanish in a single storm unless conditions preserve them. Entire generations can live and die without leaving anything that will ever be found by a modern archaeologist. So when scientists notice apparent gaps in the fossil record, those gaps may reflect many different things. A true decline in population, migration away from a region, poor preservation, sites buried too deeply to discover, sites destroyed by erosion, or simply the enormous incompleteness of our evidence. This is why the possible bottleneck cannot be treated as a settled scene from a film. We cannot point to one valley and say, there, that is where humanity nearly ended. We cannot identify the last 1,000 ancestors and place them around a single lake. The reality, if a bottleneck occurred, was almost certainly more complicated, distributed across space, uneven across time, different populations experiencing different fortunes. And there is another complication. The people alive 900,000 years ago were not all members of one simple, uniform ancestral population waiting to become us. Human evolution is not a ladder. It is a branching, merging, tangled history. Different Homo populations existed in Africa and Eurasia. Some lineages separated. Some may later have exchanged genes. Some disappeared. Others contributed in ways that are still being investigated. Even today, the deeper branches of the human family tree continue to change as new fossils are found and new methods are developed. So when we speak of our ancestors nearly disappearing, we are using a convenient phrase, a powerful phrase, but we must hold it gently. What may have become extremely small was a population ancestral to later humans as reconstructed by a particular genetic model. That is fascinating enough. It does not need exaggeration. And perhaps the uncertainty itself belongs in the story. Because science often begins with fragments. A tooth, a skull fragment, a layer of sediment, a stone hand axe, a pattern in DNA. From those fragments, researchers build explanations. Then other researchers test them. Sometimes the explanation survives. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes a better method reveals that the original picture was too simple. In 2025, another genetic approach called PLASH reported little support for a bottleneck as extreme as the one inferred by FitCoal. Researchers have continued debating the assumptions and methods involved. By 2026, the question remains alive. Was there truly a prolonged ancestral collapse of extraordinary severity around 900,000 years ago? Or are modern genetic models interpreting a more complicated ancient population structure as a dramatic decline? Could isolated populations, migration, and later mixing produce signals that resemble a bottleneck? How well can genomes from people alive today reconstruct demographic events so deep in time? These are not small questions. And for our journey, we do not need to pretend that they have already been answered. We can instead do something more interesting. We can enter the world in which such a decline might have happened. We can ask what pressures ancient humans faced, what landscapes supported them, what landscapes failed them. what skills mattered, what role cooperation might have played, what it meant to survive when survival could not be separated from water, weather, animals, stone, fire, memory, and the presence of other people. And we can remember that regardless of the exact size of any bottleneck, the populations of early humans were astonishingly small by modern standards. Today, more than 8 billion human beings live across the planet. Our lights are visible from space. Our roads cross deserts. Our ships move between continents. Our voices can reach the other side of Earth almost instantly. 900,000 years ago, none of that existed. A human group could disappear in one valley, and no one beyond the neighboring landscape would know. The death of an entire community might be witnessed only by animals, wind, and rain. And yet some communities continued. Some children survived. Some adults found water when water was scarce. Some travelers crossed into landscapes that offered another season of life. Some groups met other groups. Some knowledge was remembered. Some fires were carried. Some stone was shaped. Some food was shared. Some line of descent continued. Not because anyone understood the importance of what they were doing. Not because they believed they were preserving the future. The future did not exist for them in the way it exists for us. There was no imagined civilization waiting ahead. No Homo sapiens. No written history. No cities. No music recorded in sound. No telescopes. No mathematics written on paper. There was the next meal. The next drink of water. The next safe place to sleep. The next child to protect. The next dawn. Perhaps that is what makes this possible ancient bottleneck so moving. If humanity once approached a demographic edge, then our survival was not secured by one magnificent act. It was built from ordinary success repeated for an almost unimaginable length of time. Finding enough food, avoiding injury, remembering a path, sharing a resource, keeping a child warm, moving before a water source failed, recognizing when strangers could become companions, living one more season, then doing it again and again, across thousands of generations. So there was no single day humanity almost disappeared. There may only have been a very long age when disappearance was always possible, an age in which the boundary between continuation and extinction was crossed quietly, generation by generation. And to understand why that boundary became so dangerous, we must first leave the familiar world behind. We must travel deeper into the Pleistocene, into landscapes with different climates, different animals, different shorelines, and different kinds of humans, into a planet where our ancestors were only one small population among many living things, a planet that did not know they were important, a planet that could change without warning and without mercy. That is the world we enter next. To understand how an ancient human population could become dangerously small, we first have to imagine the world that surrounded it. Not the world as a map. Not the world divided into nations, roads, borders, and cities. But the world as an animal would have known it. A world of water, shade, wind, stone, open grass, forest edges, animal trails, seasonal rivers, distant mountains, and places where survival was possible for only part of the year. 900,000 years ago, the Earth was already deep within the Pleistocene, the long geological epoch often associated in popular imagination with ice ages. But the phrase ice age can be misleading. The planet was not locked beneath one permanent sheet of ice. Instead, Climate moved through repeated cycles. Glaciers expanded and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell. Temperatures shifted. Rain belts moved. Habitats changed. Some regions became wetter. Others became drier. Landscapes that supported abundant life during one phase might become much harsher during another. And for early humans, those changes were not background scenery. They were the conditions of existence. Picture an early morning beside a lake somewhere in Africa. The sky is pale. The air is cool. The surface of the water is almost still. Near the reeds, the rounded backs of hippopotamuses break the surface. Birds move through the shallows. Farther out, a herd of large herbivores approaches cautiously to drink. The mud around the shore is crowded with tracks, some fresh, some from the previous night, some belonging to animals that would be dangerous to approach. The people living nearby know these signs. They must. Their knowledge is not written. It is carried in memory, in observation, in repeated experience. A child learns by watching where adults step, which plants are touched, which plants are ignored, which animals may be approached after death, which animals must be avoided even when they appear weak, where sharp stone can be collected, where water remains after the rains have stopped. This is not primitive knowledge. It is detailed ecological intelligence, and it is essential because there is no supply chain behind these people. Everything that keeps them alive has to come from the landscape around them. Food must be found. Water must be located. Tools must be made from available materials. Warmth must come from the sun, shelter, bodies, and perhaps fire where fire was controlled and maintained. A wound cannot be treated in a clinic. A broken tooth cannot be repaired. A serious infection can become fatal. A failed water source can become a crisis. And even so, life is not constant misery. That is another modern mistake we should avoid. Prehistoric life was difficult, but difficulty does not mean that every hour was filled with terror. There would have been quiet mornings, children playing, adults resting after food had been found, familiar paths, repeated routines, recognizable seasons, moments of curiosity, moments of boredom, perhaps laughter, perhaps forms of affection and reassurance that would feel immediately understandable to us, even though the people expressing them were not yet members of our species. The world was dangerous, but it was also home. And home, even in deep prehistory, is something learned through familiarity. The human populations of this period were not Homo sapiens. That distinction matters. Modern Homo sapiens appeared much later. Around 900,000 years ago, different populations of the genus Homo occupied parts of Africa and Eurasia. Their exact relationships remain the subject of scientific debate. Fossils from this broad period are often difficult to place neatly into the categories we prefer to use. Some are assigned to Homo erectus. Others have been discussed under different species names depending on the specimen, location, and researcher. The evolutionary tree is not a clean diagram in the ground. It is something reconstructed from incomplete remains. A jaw here, a skull there, a few teeth, fragments of limb bones, stone tools separated from their makers by hundreds of thousands of years. And so we should resist the temptation to imagine one uniform ancestral humanity spread across the old world. There were different populations, some connected, some isolated, some perhaps separated for very long periods. Some would leave descendants, others would not. In Africa, populations lived across an enormous range of environments: open grasslands, woodlands, lake basins, river valleys, highlands, more arid regions, places where water was relatively dependable, places where rainfall could transform the land for a season and then withdraw again. To the north and east, other hominins had already moved beyond Africa. Evidence from Eurasia shows that early human dispersals had begun long before the period of our story. That does not mean there was one great migration involving a single people marching outward. Human expansion was probably far less orderly. Groups moved. Some settled. Some died out. Others moved again. Over generations, a population could travel great distances without any individual ever experiencing the journey as a migration across continents. Imagine a group shifting its territory only a few kilometers during one generation, then another group of descendants moving somewhat farther, then another. Over centuries, the accumulated movement becomes substantial. Over thousands of years, it can become continental. No map is required. Only repeated decisions about where food, water, and safety are more likely to be found. This is one of the strange properties of deep time. Small movements become enormous when multiplied by enough generations. The same is true of environmental change. A shoreline retreating by a little each year may eventually leave a former settlement far from water. A forest thinning gradually may become open grassland. A river cutting through sediment may move its channel. Animals follow these changes. Humans must follow as well, or adapt to something different. Around a large lake, life could be rich. There might be fish, water birds, shellfish in some environments, edible plants, roots and tubers, animals coming to drink, predators attracted to those same animals. Water brings opportunity. It also brings competition. A hominin approaching the shore is not entering a peaceful pantry. It is entering a meeting place for many species. Large cats may be nearby. Hyenas may be watching. Crocodiles may wait at the edge. Other scavengers may arrive at a carcass. A meal can become dangerous very quickly. And yet places like lakes and rivers are difficult to abandon. Water determines almost everything. A group can survive without a particular kind of meat. It can survive without a particular fruit. But it cannot survive long without water. That simple fact turns geography into destiny. A reliable spring can support repeated visits for generations. A river corridor can become a route through an otherwise dry region. A lake basin can concentrate animals and edible plants. And when those sources fail, survival becomes movement. Now picture the same lake after years of reduced rainfall. The shoreline is farther away. The mud is cracked. Reeds that once formed dense margins survive only in scattered patches. Animals still arrive, but not in the same numbers. Some herds have changed their routes. The humans who remember the old shoreline must walk across exposed ground where water once stood. Children grow up knowing the smaller lake. Then their children know something smaller still. At some point, the community has to decide whether this place remains worth staying near. We do not know how those decisions were made. There were no councils recorded in writing, no surviving speeches. But decisions existed, whether spoken, gestured, or simply expressed through action. Stay. Leave. Wait. Follow the animals. Return to the river. Move toward higher ground. Cross the open plain. These choices carried risk. To move was dangerous, but to remain could be worse. A landscape known in detail offers security. People know where stone can be found, where animals cross, where trees produce edible foods, where shade lasts through the hottest part of the day, where predators tend to travel. Moving means losing some of that knowledge. A new landscape is full of uncertainty. Perhaps there is water beyond the ridge. Perhaps there is not. Perhaps another group already uses that place. Perhaps a route remembered from childhood still works. Perhaps it ends in dry ground. And distance itself can be dangerous. An injured person slows the group. Children must be carried or closely watched. Food gathered in one place does not travel indefinitely. A move that seems short on a modern map can be an exhausting journey on foot through unfamiliar terrain. This is why ecological refuges are so important when we think about prehistoric survival. A refuge does not need to be a perfect paradise. It only needs to remain habitable while surrounding areas become less reliable. A valley holding water through dry years. A highland with cooler temperatures and dependable vegetation. A river system that continues flowing. A lake shore where resources remain diverse. A coastal zone with foods unavailable inland. Such places can shelter populations during periods of climatic stress. And if groups become concentrated in them, refugees may also change social life. People who once occupied widely separated territories may encounter one another more often. Sometimes that could mean competition, sometimes avoidance, sometimes conflict. But sometimes contact might provide something equally important. Mates, information, shared knowledge, different tool traditions, knowledge of another water source, a route through unfamiliar land, genetic connection between populations. When numbers are low, isolation can become dangerous. A small group cut off for too long has fewer potential partners. It is more vulnerable to accidents. A few deaths can change its future. A failed birth can matter greatly. The disappearance of several adults may erase knowledge that no one else possessed. Connection with other groups can therefore become as important as connection with the landscape. We cannot know how often such contact occurred around 900,000 years ago. But human evolution repeatedly shows a pattern of movement, separation, and later mixture. The human family has never been only a story of isolated branches. Branches sometimes meet again. And even at this early stage, the geography of survival may have shaped who encountered whom. The animals of this world also remind us how different it was. Many familiar categories existed. Elephants and their relatives, hippopotamuses, bovids, horses and horse relatives in various regions, large carnivores, primates. But species changed across time and place. Some animals would look familiar at a distance and strange up close. Others have no living equivalent. The ecological communities surrounding early humans were not modern African savannas simply transported backward in time. They belonged to another world, a dynamic world of changing faunas and climates. And ancient humans were not its rulers. They were participants, often vulnerable participants. There is a tendency to imagine the genus Homo as already dominant because we know what came later. We know about agriculture, cities, industry, satellites. We look backward from the outcome and assume that success was somehow built in from the beginning. But nothing about the landscape 900,000 years ago promised our future dominance. A small human group could be attacked, starve, lose access to water, become isolated, fail to reproduce, disappear. Many human populations did disappear across evolutionary history. Extinction is not an unusual accident in nature. It is one of the ordinary outcomes of evolution. Species emerge. Populations expand. Conditions change. Competition shifts. Some lineages adapt. Some move. Some split. Some vanish. The surprising fact is not that ancient human groups faced extinction. The surprising fact is that at least one chain of ancestry continued all the way to us. Imagine standing on a hill at sunset in this ancient world. There are no artificial lights, no roads glowing in the distance, no aircraft crossing the sky, no sound of engines. As darkness spreads, the landscape becomes almost complete. If a small fire burns somewhere below, its light reaches only a short distance. Beyond it lies an enormous night. Perhaps another human group is only 20 kilometers away, perhaps 50, perhaps much farther. No one can call them. No one can know whether they are healthy. No one can know whether they have found water. The entire human presence in a region may consist of scattered points separated by vast darkness. That is difficult for us to imagine. Modern humanity is crowded, connected, noisy. Even remote places are mapped. Satellites photograph them. Aircraft cross them. Signals pass above them. For our ancient ancestors, the world was physically immense in a way that has almost disappeared from modern experience. A mountain was not scenery. It was an obstacle that could take days to cross. A river was not a blue line. It could be food, danger, direction, and boundary at once. A dry plain could represent a barrier between groups. A lake could define the center of life. And the distance between two communities could be the difference between genetic connection and isolation. This matters when we return to the possibility of a population bottleneck. A decline in ancestral population size would not have happened in empty space. It would have been shaped by this geography, by where water survived, by where vegetation remained productive, by where prey moved, by which routes were still passable, by which groups could find one another, by which groups became trapped in shrinking habitats. The earth itself was constantly redrawing the map, not with borders, with rainfall, temperature, ice, grass, forest, river, dust, and sea level. Then, over long stretches of the Pleistocene, another transformation was taking place. The rhythm of climate was changing. Glacial cycles were becoming more intense and increasingly dominated by longer patterns. This broad transition did not occur in 1 year or 1 century. It unfolded across an immense span of time. But for populations living inside it, the consequences could become local and immediate. A colder phase, a drier landscape, a disappearing wetland, a migration route closing, a population splitting, a refuge shrinking. Climate does not need to kill with a single catastrophe. It can change the rules until yesterday's successful way of living no longer works. And somewhere in this changing world, ancient human populations had to respond. Some moved. Some adapted. Some may have found refuge. Some almost certainly disappeared. If the genetic signal identified by FitCoal reflects a real and severe ancestral bottleneck, then this unstable world may have been more than scenery. It may have been one of the forces that pushed our distant lineage toward an evolutionary edge, not through one terrible day, but through countless ordinary changes. One lake becoming smaller, one dry season lasting longer, one animal migration shifting away, one group walking farther for water, one generation inheriting a world slightly harder than the one before. And in the next chapter, We will follow that change more closely. We will enter a time when climate may have altered the rules of survival itself. Climate does not need to arrive like an enemy. It does not need thunder. It does not need fire. It does not need to destroy a landscape in a single night. Sometimes climate changes the world by degrees. A little less rain, a slightly longer dry season, a colder winter, a lake that does not refill completely, a grassland that spreads where woodland once stood, a herd that shifts its route by a few kilometers, a spring that still flows, but more weakly than before. These changes are easy to miss when they happen slowly. But life depends on thresholds. A river can become too shallow for certain animals. A valley can become too dry for particular plants. A region that once supported several human groups can become capable of supporting only one. And when a population is already small, such changes can matter enormously. Around 900,000 years ago, the Earth was passing through a major climatic transition within the Pleistocene. Glacial cycles were becoming more intense. The planet was moving toward longer and stronger patterns of ice expansion and retreat. This broad shift is often associated with what researchers call the Middle Pleistocene transition. It did not begin on a single date. It unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years. Yet its effects may have been felt in many smaller, local ways. In Africa, rainfall patterns changed repeatedly. Some areas became cooler. Some became drier. Lakes expanded during wetter intervals and shrank during dry ones. Woodlands could retreat. Open environments could spread. And the people living there had to adjust to a world that offered no guarantee of stability. Imagine a small community living near a broad seasonal lake. During a favorable period, the place is generous. Water remains through much of the year. Animals come to drink. Birds gather. Edible plants grow in damp soils. Children learn to recognize the shoreline as the center of their world. They know the path to the water. They know the rocks nearby. They know where shade can be found during the hottest hours. Then the rains begin arriving later. At first, the difference is not dramatic. The lake is still there. The community survives. But perhaps the waterline retreats by the end of the dry season. Perhaps animals become more concentrated around the remaining pools. That might create opportunities for hunting or scavenging. It might also increase danger from predators. The following year, the rains are weak again. Then again, a place that once supported life easily becomes crowded with competition. Humans, large herbivores, carnivores, scavengers, all gathering around fewer reliable resources. The landscape has not become empty. It has become tense. And tension matters. When resources are abundant, several groups can live across a region without constant contact. When waterholes shrink, those same groups may be forced closer together. Some encounters could be peaceful. Some could lead to sharing or exchange. Others could involve aggression. We have no written record of such meetings. No names. No stories. No witness. But ecology alone tells us that competition becomes sharper when essential resources become scarce. A river valley that once offered many stopping places may narrow into a few dependable zones. A migration route that once allowed easy movement may become dangerous. A dry belt may separate populations that had previously encountered one another. And isolation can become a silent demographic threat. For a large modern population, the loss of a few families changes almost nothing. For a small Pleistocene group, every adult matters. Every child matters. Every successful birth matters. Every connection to another group can matter. A population can become vulnerable not only because many people die, but because the surviving groups become too scattered. This is one reason the idea of fragmentation is so important. Picture the landscape not as one continuous habitat, but as islands. Not islands surrounded by water, islands of survival surrounded by difficult ground. A green valley here, a river corridor there, a highland basin with dependable springs, a wetland that persists through dry years. Between them, long stretches where food and water are harder to find. For animals capable of long movement, these gaps may still be crossed. For small human communities carrying children, tools, and food, the same distances can become serious barriers. This is where the idea of refugia becomes useful. A refugium is a place where conditions remain suitable while surrounding regions become less favorable. It does not need to be comfortable. It only needs to be survivable. A river that continues flowing when other streams fail. A valley that captures enough rainfall. A patch of woodland protected by elevation. A lake shore where several types of food remain available. A coastal zone with dependable marine resources. For ancient humans, such places could have been more than temporary shelters. They could have become centers of continuity. Imagine one of these refugees. Outside it, the land has become increasingly dry. Vegetation is sparse. Animal routes have shifted. But inside the valley, water still gathers. Trees remain near the river. Small animals are present. Larger herbivores visit. Stone for tools can be found in exposed deposits. It is not a paradise. Predators still hunt. Injury still kills. Children still become sick. But compared with the surrounding region, the valley offers predictability. And predictability is one of the most valuable resources in prehistory. People can remember where water is found. They can return to known places. They can teach the next generation. That continuity reduces uncertainty. But a refuge can also become a trap. If too many groups depend on it, pressure rises. If the water eventually fails, those who remained may have nowhere else to go. If surrounding routes become too dry, isolation deepens. A place that preserves life for centuries can still become dangerous over longer spans. This is the rhythm of climatic stress. Not one collapse, a sequence of pressures, some temporary, some lasting, some survivable, some not. And the difficulty for ancient humans was that they could not see the larger pattern. They did not know whether a dry phase would last 1 year or 100. They could not know whether a shrinking lake would recover in the lifetime of their children. They could not compare rainfall records across centuries. They had memory, observation, experience. Perhaps stories passed from older individuals to younger ones. But there were limits to how far memory could reach. That means many decisions had to be made under uncertainty. Do we stay? Do we move? Do we follow the herd? Do we return to the old river? Do we cross the dry plain? Do we wait for the rains? A wrong choice might not kill everyone immediately. It could simply make the next month harder, then the next. A missed water source weakens people. Weakness reduces the ability to travel. Reduced mobility makes it harder to find food. Poor nutrition affects fertility and child survival. A small group becomes smaller. The effects accumulate. This is how climate can shape population without one visible disaster. One small disadvantage becomes another, and another. A group of 40 becomes 30, then 20. Then perhaps some leave to seek other people. Perhaps they succeed. Perhaps they do not. Eventually, the place is empty. From the perspective of deep time, this looks like disappearance. From the perspective of the people living through it, it may have felt like a series of difficult decisions. There is another important part of the story. Climate change does not affect every region in the same way. When one area becomes less habitable, another may improve. A dry period in one zone can coincide with a wetter period elsewhere. Grasslands may expand and open new routes. Rivers can become corridors. Lower sea levels can expose new land. Animal populations can move into places they did not previously occupy. This means climate is not only a force of destruction, it is also a force of redistribution. It closes some doors and opens others. And ancient humans were mobile enough to exploit some of those openings. By this period, hominins were already living beyond Africa. Populations had reached parts of Eurasia long before 900,000 years ago. During later phases, changing climates may have repeatedly influenced when and where human groups could move. We should not imagine one migration out of Africa followed by permanent settlement. The deeper reality was probably waves, expansions, retreats, local extinctions, new movements, repeated attempts to occupy changing landscapes. A region that was habitable for 10,000 years might later become too cold or too dry. A population could disappear there. Then much later, another group could arrive under different conditions. The map of human occupation was always being redrawn. This makes the possible bottleneck more complicated. If population size really fell dramatically, was climate the primary cause? Or one cause among many? Could habitat fragmentation have reduced contact between groups? Could changes in animal communities have affected access to food? Could disease have played a role? Could population structure itself create a genetic signal that resembles collapse? These questions remain open. Science rarely gives us one cause for a process this ancient. But climate is difficult to ignore because it shapes nearly everything else. Water, plants, animals, movement, shelter, firewood. Even the kinds of stone accessible in exposed landscapes can be influenced by erosion and environmental change. Climate changes the stage on which all other decisions are made. And perhaps that is why the idea of a slow climatic crisis feels so different from the dramatic extinction stories we are used to. There is no villain, no single enemy, no moment when the world announces that the rules have changed. The rules simply become less forgiving. A child must walk farther to reach water. An adult returns from foraging with less food. A familiar animal is no longer seen. A dry season lasts longer. A route that once worked no longer does. A group that once numbered many families now fits easily around one fire. There is no ceremony for these losses. No one writes them down. The wind moves through abandoned camps. Dust covers stone flakes. Bones are scattered. Rain eventually returns. Grass grows over the place. Thousands of years pass. Then tens of thousands. And the landscape looks new again. This is one reason the possible human bottleneck remains so difficult to connect directly to archaeology. Genetic models can suggest a deep demographic event. Climate records can show periods of major environmental change. Fossils and tools can show where hominins were present. But linking all three with precision is extremely hard. The dates are broad. The records are incomplete. Different regions preserve evidence differently. A population may move without leaving an obvious trace. A site may exist but remain buried beneath meters of sediment. A fossil may never be found. And so our picture is built from overlapping uncertainties. That does not make it meaningless. It makes it more like a landscape seen through mist. Some shapes are clear, others remain uncertain. We know climate was changing. We know hominins were widely dispersed. We know small populations are vulnerable to fragmentation. We know genetic diversity in living humans can preserve information about ancient population history. What we do not know is exactly how those elements combined. Still, we can imagine one possibility. A series of dry phases reduces habitable territory. Populations retreat toward rivers, lakes, and ecological refuges. Some groups remain connected. Others become isolated. A few fail entirely. Migration routes shift. Contact between regions becomes less frequent. Over generations, the number of individuals contributing to future ancestry declines. Then, much later, as conditions change again, populations expand. Connections reopen. New landscapes become accessible. The demographic shadow remains in the genome. Perhaps that is close to what happened. Perhaps not. But even as a hypothesis, it reveals something important about human survival. Our ancestors did not live outside nature. They were not protected from climate by technology on the scale we know today. They were embedded within local ecology. A change in rainfall could become a change in diet. A change in vegetation could become a change in movement. A change in movement could become a change in social contact. A change in social contact could become a change in genetic history. That chain is easy to miss because modern life places distance between us and many environmental systems. Water arrives through pipes. Food appears in markets. Heat comes from machines. Maps tell us where to go. Weather can be predicted days ahead. 900,000 years ago, none of those buffers existed. The world touched the body directly. Heat, cold, thirst, hunger, distance, darkness. And perhaps this direct dependence explains why survival may have favored flexibility above almost everything else. Not strength alone, not speed, not one perfect tool, but the ability to change behavior when conditions changed. To move, to remember, to experiment, to eat different foods, to learn from others, to cooperate, to abandon a familiar place when familiarity became dangerous. That kind of flexibility would become one of the defining qualities of later human evolution. But before we reach the question of how our ancestors survived, we must confront the mystery at the center of the story. How small did the ancestral population really become? Was it truly reduced to an effective breeding population of approximately 1,280 individuals? What does that number actually mean? And how can scientists attempt to estimate the size of a population that lived almost 1 million years before the first written census? The answer is hidden in a place those ancient humans could never have imagined. Not in a cave wall, not in a fossil bed, not in a stone tool, but in the genomes of people alive today. 1,280. It is a number small enough to fit inside the imagination, a number small enough to picture in a village, a number small enough to gather inside a modern theater. And that is precisely why it can be so misleading. When the 2023 FitCoal study proposed that an ancestral human population may have fallen to an average effective size of around 1,280 breeding individuals between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the result immediately sounded like a scene from the edge of extinction. Only a few people left. A nearly empty world. A handful of survivors keeping the future of humanity alive. But genetics is not quite that simple. The figure does not mean that exactly 1,280 human beings were alive on Earth. It does not mean that every ancient human population everywhere had been reduced to a single camp. It does not mean that all members of the genus Homo were standing together in one valley, separated from extinction by only a few hundred births. The number refers to something more abstract, something called effective population size. And to understand why that matters, we need to step away from the ancient landscape for a moment and enter a very different world. A laboratory, a computer screen, a genome. Inside every living human cell is a record written in DNA. Not a record in the way a diary records events. DNA does not preserve the memory of a drought. It does not contain a sentence describing a migration. It does not tell us who carried a child across a river or who died beside a shrinking lake. But populations leave statistical patterns in DNA. Large populations tend to preserve more genetic variation. Small populations lose variation more quickly. When a population contracts sharply, many lineages disappear. When it later expands, the number of living people may recover, but the lost genetic branches do not magically return. That narrowing can leave a trace. Imagine a wide river separating into many channels. Each channel represents a genetic lineage. Now imagine that the river is forced through a narrow gorge. Most channels vanish. Only a few continue through. Beyond the gorge, the river spreads again. Many channels reappear downstream, but they all descend from the smaller number that made it through the narrow passage. This is the basic idea of a population bottleneck. A population may become large again, but its genetic history still carries the shape of the contraction. The challenge is that human genomes are not simple rivers. They are the products of enormous numbers of ancestors. Populations divide. Populations migrate. Populations mix. Genes pass through different groups. Some individuals have many descendants. Others have none. Some lineages disappear through chance alone. And over hundreds of thousands of years, these processes overlap. So geneticists use mathematical models. They examine patterns in modern genomes and ask what kinds of ancient population histories could have produced them. This is where FitCoal entered the story. The method was designed to infer changes in population size through time by using information about how genetic lineages coalesce. Coalescence is a technical term, but the basic idea is simple. Take two versions of the same piece of DNA from two people living today. Follow those genetic lineages backward through their parents, then through earlier generations. Eventually, those two lineages meet in a shared ancestor. They coalesce. If you repeat this across many parts of the genome and across many individuals, patterns begin to emerge. In a large population, genetic lineages tend to remain separate for longer. There are many possible ancestors. In a small population, lineages tend to meet more quickly because fewer people are contributing genes to the future. By estimating these patterns, researchers can infer something about past population sizes. The FitCoal study analyzed genomic data from 3,154 living humans. Its models suggested a dramatic ancestral contraction beginning around 930,000 years ago and lasting until roughly 813,000 years ago. During that interval, the estimated effective breeding population was approximately 1,280 individuals on average. Again, that is not a literal census. The true number of people physically alive may have been several times higher, potentially much higher. Why? Because effective population size measures genetic contribution, not bodies. Consider a simple example. Imagine a settlement with 100 adults. All 100 are alive. All 100 eat, travel, work, and interact. But suppose only a smaller fraction have children who themselves survive and reproduce. Some adults have no children. Some children die young. Some family lines end after one generation. Other individuals have many descendants. The population counted by bodies might be 100. The population counted by long-term genetic contribution could be much smaller. Real populations are more complicated than this, but the principle is the same. Effective population size is often lower than census population. That is why saying humanity was reduced to exactly 1,280 people is not supported by the genetic estimate. And there is another complication. The word humanity itself is slippery this deep in time. Around 900,000 years ago, there were multiple hominin populations in different regions. Some lived in Africa. Others occupied parts of Eurasia. Some may have been ancestral to later populations. Others may have left no descendants alive today. Modern genomes can primarily tell us about ancestors who contributed to people who survived into later times. A population that vanished entirely can become almost invisible to this kind of analysis. So even if the FitCoal bottleneck is real, it does not necessarily describe every human relative alive at the time. It describes an ancestral population reconstructed through the genomes of living people. This distinction matters, but it does not make the result less extraordinary. If the effective population really fell that low and remained there for more than 100,000 years, then the ancestral lineage leading toward later humans survived an extremely narrow demographic passage. The number is haunting, not because we should imagine 1,280 terrified people standing together on the last patch of green land. The reality would almost certainly have been more dispersed, more complicated, and in some ways more vulnerable. Perhaps groups were scattered across separate regions. Perhaps some contained only a few dozen individuals. Perhaps some rarely encountered one another. Perhaps certain populations disappeared while others persisted. Perhaps migration repeatedly reconnected isolated communities. A genetically small population can still be geographically wide. That creates a paradox. There may have been many kilometers between people, even while the total number of successful genetic lineages remained low. Imagine a dark continent at night. No city lights, no villages, no roads, only rare fires. One here, another far beyond the horizon, another several days of walking away. Each fire surrounded by a small group. Some groups know of one another, some do not. Some exchange members, some remain isolated for generations. From the air, if we could somehow see them, the human presence might resemble scattered sparks, thin, fragile, separated by enormous spaces. Now imagine that one spark disappears, then another. A spring fails. A disease moves through a group. Several adults are lost in an accident. A childbearing woman dies. A group becomes too small to remain viable and joins another. Another group moves beyond a region and leaves no descendants. None of these events needs to be catastrophic on a continental scale. But in a population already reduced, each one matters more. Small populations are vulnerable to chance. Demographers sometimes call this demographic stochasticity. The term sounds technical. The reality is simple. When numbers are large, chance events tend to average out. When numbers are small, chance becomes powerful. A single death is proportionally larger. A few years of poor birth survival can alter the future. An unusual imbalance between males and females can matter. A local epidemic can erase an entire group. A dangerous migration can remove a substantial fraction of a community. Even pure bad luck can push numbers lower. Genetic diversity can also decline. When populations become small, rare genetic variants are easier to lose. Close relatedness becomes more common if groups remain isolated. That can create additional challenges over long periods. Yet the proposed FitCoal bottleneck is not simply remarkable for how low the number became. It is remarkable for how long the bottleneck may have lasted. More than 100,000 years. This is where the story becomes difficult to picture. A catastrophe lasting 10 years can be remembered. One lasting 50 years might shape an entire lifetime. One lasting several centuries can become history. But 100,000 years cannot be experienced by a culture as a single event. It becomes the background of existence. Imagine a child born 10,000 years after the population decline began. That child does not know the world before the bottleneck. Neither do the parents. Neither do the grandparents. No oral memory could reach to the beginning. Now move forward another 10,000 years. Another 100 generations have passed. Then another. The crisis, if we can call it that, continues. Not necessarily as constant hunger, not necessarily as constant dying. Some decades might be relatively comfortable. Some regions might support stable groups. Some generations might know abundance. But on the vast scale measured by genetics, the population would remain restricted. This is a different kind of near extinction. Not a moment when every survivor watches the same disaster. A condition. A narrow corridor through evolutionary time. And this is precisely where scientific caution becomes essential. Because an extraordinary result is not the same thing as a final answer. Genetic reconstruction is powerful, but it depends on models. Every model simplifies reality. It uses assumptions about mutation, generation length, population structure, recombination, migration, the way lineages merge backward in time. Change those assumptions, and the reconstructed past can change as well. That is why another method can look at genetic data and reach a different conclusion. A later method called FLASH found much weaker evidence for a bottleneck of the extreme magnitude proposed by FitCoal. Its results suggested that the deep population history of humans might not include such a severe and prolonged collapse. Researchers associated with FitCoal have continued to defend the original interpretation and argue that their method captures ancient demographic events differently. So the debate is not simply between people who believe a catastrophe happened and people who do not. It is a debate about inference, about how much information remains in modern genomes, about what ancient population structures can mimic a bottleneck, about what statistical methods can reliably reconstruct events nearly 1 million years old. Suppose, for example, that ancient humans were divided into several semi-isolated populations. They exchange genes occasionally, but not constantly. Some disappear. Others merge. Later, one subset contributes more heavily to the ancestors of modern people. A genetic model, assuming a simpler, more unified population, might interpret those patterns as a dramatic fall in population size. In other words, the signal of a bottleneck could, in some circumstances, reflect population structure rather than a literal near extinction. Or the reverse could be true. A genuine collapse might be underestimated by methods that smooth over ancient signals. This is why scientists compare approaches. They test assumptions. They simulate different histories. They publish criticism. They respond. They refine. From the outside, scientific disagreement can look like weakness. But disagreement is one of the mechanisms that make science useful. A claim survives not because it is dramatic. It survives because competing explanations fail to account for the evidence as well. And for this ancient bottleneck, that process is still unfolding. Perhaps future genomic methods will strengthen the case. Perhaps they will reduce the estimated severity. Perhaps they will reveal several separate contractions rather than one long decline. Perhaps ancient DNA from an unexpectedly old fossil will transform the debate. At present, the evidence should be treated as a serious hypothesis, not a finished verdict. Still, the hypothesis raises a remarkable question. What would survival look like if the ancestral human population really remained so small for so long? There would be no heroic rescue, no single invention that suddenly solved everything, no leader who restored the population, no ancient moment when people understood that they had crossed from danger into safety. Survival would have depended on ordinary things repeated endlessly. Water found before thirst became fatal. Food gathered before children weakened. A cutting edge made sharp enough to remove meat from bone. A safe place chosen before night. A fire protected from wind. A sick child carried. An injured adult fed. A route remembered. A stranger accepted. A group leaving before the last water disappeared. A group staying because leaving would have been worse. A young person surviving long enough to become a parent. Then that parent's child doing the same. And again. And again. If FitCoal is broadly correct, the real mystery is not only why the population became so small. The deeper mystery is why it did not vanish. Small populations disappear all the time in nature. A few unlucky generations can be enough. A change in rainfall, a disease, an imbalance in births, a failed migration, an isolated group with no new partners. Yet somewhere, enough communities endured. Perhaps they occupied environmental refuges. Perhaps they remained more mobile than competing species. Perhaps their diet was flexible. Perhaps tool use allowed access to resources that otherwise would have been unavailable. Perhaps fire expanded the range of environments they could tolerate. Perhaps social cooperation buffered individuals against hunger, injury, and uncertainty. Perhaps contact between groups prevented complete isolation. And perhaps luck mattered more than we like to admit. Evolution does not guarantee survival to the most intelligent. It does not reward species according to a plan. Sometimes a population persists because a drought ends at the right time, because a storm misses one valley, because a child survives an infection, because two groups encounter one another before either becomes too small, because one route remains open, because one lake does not dry completely. The line between extinction and continuation can be narrow. And if the ancestral bottleneck was as severe as the FitCoal model suggests, then our own existence may rest upon thousands of such narrow passages. Not one miracle. A chain of ordinary probabilities that happen not to break. This is the unsettling beauty of the number 1280. It tempts us to imagine the last survivors, but its real meaning is subtler. It asks us to imagine a genetic corridor, a population reduced enough that randomness, isolation, climate, and cooperation may all have mattered more than usual. A long period when there were fewer branches on the ancestral tree, fewer chances, fewer margins for failure. And yet the tree did not end. Some branches continued. They crossed the narrow place. They reached later populations. Much later, those populations would split and mix again. Neanderthals would emerge. Denisovans would emerge. Homo sapiens would eventually appear. And still later, one human being would sit beneath electric light, look at a sequence of DNA on a screen, and ask a question no ancient ancestor could possibly have understood. How many of you were left? We do not yet know the final answer. Perhaps we never will. But even uncertainty can guide us toward a deeper truth. Ancient human survival was never automatic. It depended on ecology, on behavior, on chance, on community, and on generation after generation succeeding just enough to continue. So now we leave the numbers behind. We return to the water's edge, to the stone in a hand, to the remains of a fire, to a small group waking under a cold Pleistocene sky. If there really were so few ancestral lineages left, what allowed them to persist for tens of thousands of years? What practical habits could keep a tiny community alive in an unstable world? The answer was probably not one brilliant adaptation. It was many small advantages woven together, and that is where we turn next. There is something almost misleading about the word survival. It sounds dramatic. It suggests a moment of danger, a predator charging from the grass, a flood crossing a valley, a desperate night in the cold. But surviving 100,000 years is not a single act. It is not bravery performed once. It is routine. It is repetition. It is knowledge used so often that no one needs to call it knowledge. It is choosing the right path before the heat rises. It is knowing which water can be trusted. It is remembering where edible roots grow after the rains. It is repairing a stone edge before it becomes useless. It is sharing food with someone who cannot gather enough alone. It is leaving a familiar place before that place becomes a trap. If an ancestral population truly passed through a prolonged bottleneck near 900,000 years ago, then no individual saved humanity. No one even knew that there was a humanity to save. The future survived because thousands of small groups made enough successful decisions across thousands of generations for the chain of descent to continue. And nearly all of those decisions have disappeared without a trace. We can begin with the most obvious requirement: water. For a modern person, water can seem almost invisible. Turn a handle and it appears. It is stored behind dams, moved through pipes, filtered, measured, delivered across cities. For ancient humans, water was geography. A group could not simply live wherever the land looked attractive. It had to remain within reach of places where water could be found reliably enough to support children, adults, and movement. That meant knowing the landscape with extraordinary precision. A stream that flowed during the rains might vanish during the dry season. A lake could shrink toward its center. Pools might remain in shaded depressions after exposed water disappeared. Animal trails might lead toward springs. Certain plants could indicate damp ground. Bird movements could suggest nearby water. The ability to read these signs would not require science in the modern sense. It required attention and memory. The older members of a group may have carried especially valuable information, not because age automatically meant authority. We cannot know the exact social structure of populations this ancient, but an individual who had experienced many seasons might remember a water source that younger adults had never needed. A severe drought can make old information suddenly useful. There is a quiet power in that idea, a place remembered from childhood, a path almost forgotten. a spring beyond a ridge. Knowledge carried inside one mind for years, waiting until the landscape made it necessary again. This is one reason social groups can survive situations that isolated individuals cannot. The group stores memory across many people. One person knows where stone can be found. Another recognizes edible plants. Another understands animal movement. Another remembers a route to distant water. No individual needs to know everything. Collective knowledge becomes a survival tool. Then there was food. We should resist imagining early humans as creatures dependent on one simple diet. The exact foods available varied enormously with place, season, and opportunity. Different environments offered different plants, animals, insects, roots, seeds, fruits, and other resources. Meat may have been obtained through hunting, scavenging, or combinations that remain difficult to reconstruct in detail for any particular population. What mattered in an unstable environment was flexibility. A population dependent on one narrow resource can become vulnerable when that resource disappears. A population able to shift among several foods has more options. Imagine a dry season when large animals move away. The group cannot command them to return. It must use what remains. Smaller animals, plant foods, underground storage organs, seeds. Whatever local knowledge and available technology make accessible. Then, in another season, a carcass may provide a sudden abundance of meat and fat. The difference between starvation and survival may depend less on perfect hunting skill than on knowing how to exploit opportunity. This is where stone tools become crucial. A sharp stone does not look impressive beside modern machinery. It is easy to underestimate, but place one in the hand of someone who has learned how to use it, and the landscape changes. Hide can be cut, tendons severed, meat removed, plants processed, wood shaped. A carcass that another predator opened can become accessible more efficiently. A broken edge can be replaced. A larger tool can be reshaped. By 900,000 years ago, stone tool traditions had already existed for an immense span of time. In parts of Africa and beyond, Acheulean technologies, including large cutting tools such as hand axes and cleavers, had become well established long before this period. But even here, we should avoid imagining technological progress as a rapid ladder leading inevitably toward modernity. Change could be slow, very slow. A basic tool form could persist across extraordinary lengths of time. Innovation did happen, but often the more important achievement was reliable transmission. A useful technique is only evolutionarily valuable if others can learn it. One individual can accidentally discover a better way to strike stone. If no one copies it, the knowledge dies with that person. If others learn it, the technique can survive. If children observe it and repeat it, the behavior can cross generations. The survival of technology therefore depends on social learning. And that brings us back to community. Human beings are biologically unusual in the amount of time our young require care. Even ancient Homo did not produce offspring that could simply stand up and live independently. Children needed protection, food, teaching, time. A long childhood is expensive, but it also creates an enormous opportunity. A young individual has years to learn where to walk, what to fear, what to eat, how to shape stone, how to interact with others, how to recognize familiar routes, how to behave around dangerous animals, how to understand seasonal change. Knowledge can accumulate because the young have time to acquire it. In a stable world, some of that learning may feel repetitive. In an unstable world, it becomes insurance. A child who grows up knowing several food sources is better prepared when one fails. A child who knows more than one route to water has options. A child who understands several landscapes may survive displacement more easily. This is culture in its deepest sense, not writing, not art museums, not laws, but learned behavior passed socially from one generation to another. How much cultural complexity existed 900,000 years ago remains debated. We should not project modern social systems backward without evidence. But the very persistence of stone technology and widespread ecological adaptation tells us that learning mattered. It had to. Then there is fire. Few images are more powerful in stories of human origins. A dark landscape, a circle of faces, orange light moving across stone and skin. Fire feels so deeply human that it is tempting to place it everywhere in prehistory. But the evidence for habitual, controlled fire at this depth of time is complicated. There are sites from the early and middle Pleistocene that have been interpreted as preserving evidence of burning associated with hominin activity. Some evidence is stronger than others. Researchers continue debating how consistently different populations controlled, maintained, or created fire during this broad period. So we should be careful. We cannot assume that every group 900,000 years ago sat beside a dependable fire every night. But where fire was available and successfully managed, its advantages could be substantial. Warmth, light, protection, cooking, a way to alter some foods, a way to extend activity beyond daylight, possibly a means of reducing some risks from predators, and perhaps something more difficult to measure, a place to gather. Fire reorganizes space. Without artificial light, darkness quickly limits movement. Around a flame, a small zone remains visible. People remain close. Food may be processed. Tools may be repaired. Children may stay near adults. Communication continues after sunset. Even if controlled fire was not universally reliable during this period, the broader trajectory toward a more regular fire use would eventually become one of the most significant shifts in human adaptation. Yet perhaps the most powerful survival technology was not made of stone or flame. It was movement. When a place becomes impossible, strength is not enough. You cannot defeat a drought with muscle. You cannot argue with a vanished lake. Sometimes the only successful response is to leave. Mobility is costly. It means entering uncertain territory. But it also prevents dependence on a single failing habitat. Early Homo populations had already demonstrated extraordinary dispersal ability. Hominins had moved far beyond the landscapes where the earliest members of our genus evolved. They had crossed ecological boundaries, entered unfamiliar climates, followed river systems, moved through grasslands and woodland mosaics, occupied regions separated by enormous distances. This did not happen because one explorer decided to conquer a continent. It happened gradually, generation after generation, short movements becoming long migrations when viewed across deep time. For a small population facing environmental instability, mobility could function as a kind of insurance. If a lake failed, another might exist farther away. If a region became too dry, a river corridor might offer passage. If local prey disappeared, another habitat might support different foods. But there is a limit. A group can only move if it knows suspects or discovers somewhere worth moving toward. This is why contact between groups could have mattered so much. Imagine two communities encountering one another near a water source. They may be cautious. Each group knows that the other uses the same resources. Competition is possible, but the encounter also contains information. The newcomers came from somewhere. They know other paths, other water, other stone sources, other seasonal conditions. Human contact is not only genetic exchange, it can be information exchange. Again, we cannot know the details of communication this ancient. The evolution of language is deeply debated, and there is no way to reconstruct a spoken conversation from 900,000 years ago. But communication did not need to resemble modern speech to be useful. Gesture, vocalization, demonstration, shared attention, following, imitation. Even simple forms of communication can transmit important information. A direction, a warning, a food source, a tool technique, a willingness to remain nearby. And if two groups exchanged members, the value went deeper still. Small isolated populations face genetic risk. Connections between groups can reduce that isolation. They can introduce new genetic variation. They can expand the network of potential mates. They can make local extinction less final because a lineage may continue elsewhere. This may be one of the least dramatic but most important elements of long-term survival. The future of a population does not depend only on how many people are alive. It depends on how connected they are. A landscape containing several isolated groups can be fragile. A landscape containing groups linked by occasional movement may be more resilient. If one community loses members, another can contribute. If one area fails, people can relocate. If one route closes, another network may remain. Survival becomes distributed. And then there is care. Archaeology gives us occasional glimpses from different periods of human evolution, suggesting that injured or impaired individuals sometimes survived conditions that may have required assistance from others. We must be cautious about projecting specific examples directly onto populations 900,000 years ago. But cooperative living almost certainly had deep evolutionary roots. A badly injured adult who survives long enough to recover may benefit from food sharing or protection. A mother caring for a dependent child may depend on others during difficult periods. Children may receive attention from more than one adult. A successful foraging return can feed individuals who were less successful that day. Sharing reduces variance. That sounds abstract. Its consequences are intimate. One person comes back with food. Another comes back with nothing. If everyone eats only what they personally acquire, the unlucky individual goes hungry. If food is shared, failure is buffered. Tomorrow the roles may reverse. Over enough days, cooperation can make the entire group more resilient to chance. This matters greatly when conditions are unpredictable. And perhaps this is one of the deepest reasons human sociality became so powerful. A body can fail. A hunt can fail. A route can fail. But a network can absorb some failure. Not all of it. No amount of cooperation can make water appear in a completely dry landscape. No group can eliminate disease, injury, or hunger. But cooperation changes probabilities. And evolution is built from probabilities. A small advantage repeated across thousands of generations becomes enormous. This may be the correct scale at which to think about survival through a prolonged bottleneck. Not one miraculous adaptation, many slight advantages. Knowing the landscape a little better, eating a slightly wider range of foods, making tools efficiently, learning from older individuals, remaining mobile, maintaining contact, caring for children, sharing risk, leaving at the right time, staying at the right time, and always luck. Luck is uncomfortable in stories of human origins. We prefer explanations that make survival feel deserved. Intelligence, skill, cooperation, adaptability. All of these likely mattered. But nature does not promise survival to those who possess admirable traits. Sometimes a well-adapted group is struck by catastrophe. Sometimes a less capable group happens to occupy the right valley. Sometimes rain falls 20 kilometers away and not here. Sometimes an infection kills one person and spares another. Sometimes a newborn survives. Sometimes it does not. If an ancestral population remained small for an immense span of time, chance would have been woven through every generation. Perhaps a group found water one day before it would have been too late. Perhaps a dangerous crossing succeeded. Perhaps an injured adult recovered. Perhaps two isolated groups met by accident. Perhaps a child who nearly died grew to adulthood and eventually became an ancestor of millions. We will never know. And that may be the most important point. The people who continued our lineage were not historical heroes. Their victories were too small for monuments. A dry season survived. A wound healed. A meal shared. A child protected. A route remembered. These events disappear almost completely from archaeology. But biologically they are everything. Because a lineage does not need to conquer the world. It only needs to continue. One generation reaches the next, then the next, then the next. That is all. Now imagine this process stretched across 1,000 years, then 10,000, then 50,000, then 100,000. Thousands of births, thousands of deaths, thousands of migrations, communities forming and splitting, children becoming adults, adults becoming elders, knowledge transmitted, knowledge lost, landscapes changing, rivers moving, lakes shrinking, rain returning. No one can see the whole story. Each person experiences only a tiny fragment, and yet all those fragments connect. This is where the scale of the possible bottleneck becomes emotionally difficult to understand. Numbers like 930,000 years ago and 813,000 years ago look clean on a page. They create the illusion of a beginning and an ending. But no one living inside those years experienced them as dates. There was no first generation that said the bottleneck has begun. There was no final generation that celebrated its end. There were only lives, one after another, almost all forgotten. And if we want to understand how an ancient population endured for so long, perhaps we should stop looking at the 100,000 years. Perhaps we should look at one person, one childhood, one family, one season, then another, because deep time is not actually made of millennia. It is made of ordinary days experienced by ordinary beings. And in the next chapter, we will slow the story down. We will leave behind population models and climatic graphs. We will follow the generations that no one remembers. The people who lived between the great dates. The people whose names vanished before writing existed. The people who never knew that simply staying alive was carrying the human story forward. History remembers names, kings, generals, explorers, inventors, people who signed treaties, built monuments, founded cities, fought wars, and left behind words that survived them. But for almost all of human existence, there were no written names. No dates of birth, no carved memorials, no lists of the dead. There were only lives, A child was born. The child grew. The child learned. The child survived long enough to become an adult. Perhaps that adult became a parent. Perhaps not. Perhaps the person lived for 20 years. Perhaps 30. Perhaps longer. Then one day, that life ended, and the world continued. This happened again, and again, and again, for tens of thousands of years. If the ancient population bottleneck proposed by FitCoal truly lasted from roughly 930,000 to 813,000 years ago, then no single human lifetime could contain even the smallest meaningful portion of it. A person could be born, grow old, and die. Their children could do the same. Then their grandchildren. Then their great-grandchildren. And after all of those lives had passed, the population crisis might still have been only beginning. This is the strange scale of deep time. It is easy to say 100,000 years. It takes only a few seconds. But to live 100,000 years is something else entirely. Suppose, only as a rough thought experiment, that one generation averaged around 25 years. Then 100,000 years would contain roughly 4,000 generations. 4,000 times when children had to survive long enough to become adults. 4,000 times when knowledge had to pass forward. 4,000 times when small communities had to find enough food, enough water, enough safety, and enough social stability for another generation to exist. 4,000 generations is almost impossible to imagine. So let us reduce the scale. Let us begin with one. Imagine a girl born beside a river in a landscape we would barely recognize. Her parents do not know the year. There is no year to know. There is no calendar. There is only the season. Perhaps she is born after the rains. The grass is still green. The river is broad enough that animals gather along its banks. Her earliest memories are not words on a page. They are sensations. Warm skin, smoke perhaps if the group uses fire, the smell of wet ground, insects, the calls of animals after sunset, the touch of an adult hand pulling her away from danger. She learns before she understands that she is learning. Do not walk there. Stay near the group. That plant can be eaten. That one cannot. Those tracks are fresh. That sound means an animal is nearby. Follow this path. Watch the water. Do not approach the reeds carelessly. By the time she is older, the landscape exists inside her memory. She knows it as we know the rooms of a familiar house. There is a bend in the river where stone can be collected. There is a grove that produces food during one season. There is a place where animals often cross. There is a ridge from which distant movement can be seen. There is a shallow shelter used during bad weather. This knowledge is not theoretical. It is survival. And she did not invent most of it. Someone showed her. Someone older. Perhaps a parent. Perhaps another adult. Perhaps several people. Their own knowledge had come from people before them. Already the chain stretches backward. No books. No schools. No archive. Only minds. Memory becomes the library. Demonstration becomes the lesson. Repetition becomes the method of preservation. Years pass. The girl becomes an adult. Some members of her childhood group are gone. Perhaps an older relative dies. Perhaps a younger child does not survive sickness. Perhaps others leave. New children are born. The group is not static. It changes constantly. And then the climate changes slightly. The river is lower than she remembers. Not dangerously low. Not yet. but different. She notices because she has lived long enough to compare seasons. Children born that year do not notice anything unusual. For them, this is simply what the river looks like. That difference matters. Every generation inherits a world and assumes, at first, that the world is normal. Older people carry the memory of what was. Younger people learn what is. In an unstable climate, survival may depend on combining both. Perhaps the woman remembers a pool farther upstream that held water during a dry season when she was young. Years later, another difficult season arrives. The group moves toward that place. Maybe the pool is still there. Maybe it is not. If it is, an old memory has become a bridge into the future. That is a victory. But there is no celebration, no monument, no record, only water, only another day. This may be how many of the most important victories in human history actually looked. Small, local, almost invisible. A child survives a fever. A wound does not become infected. A group finds shelter before a storm. A dry season water source lasts a few weeks longer than expected. A carcass is discovered before other scavengers strip it completely. A dangerous animal passes in the night without attacking. A mother survives childbirth. Two groups meet, and instead of separating forever, some individuals move between them. A young person reaches reproductive age. None of these events seems worthy of the word historic. But during a severe population bottleneck, history is exactly what they are. Because when numbers are low, survival is made from margins. One person matters more. One birth matters more. One death matters more. One successful journey matters more. Imagine now that the woman's child becomes an adult. The older generation fades. The younger generation takes its place. Perhaps the river continues shrinking. Perhaps the group moves. They travel toward another basin. The landscape changes. The stone is different. The animals are less familiar. There are new dangers. But the group carries something more valuable than possessions. It carries experience. Someone knows how to shape a useful edge. Someone recognizes certain routes. Someone remembers how to follow animal trails toward water. Someone knows how to calm a frightened child during a long journey. Someone understands which signs mean rain may be coming. Skills travel inside people. If people die, skills can die with them. This is another danger of small populations. A modern society stores information outside the body. Books, files, photographs, maps, databases. A person can die, but much of what they knew may remain. For ancient human groups, knowledge was far more fragile. If the only person who remembered a distant spring died before passing that information on, the spring effectively vanished from the group's mental map. If a skilled toolmaker died before younger individuals had learned the technique, a useful method could weaken or disappear. If an older traveler knew a route between two valleys but never walked it again with the young, that connection might be lost. Knowledge itself could suffer bottlenecks. And perhaps this is one reason continuity mattered so deeply. Survival was not just bodies producing more bodies. It was information crossing generations. How to live here. How to move there. How to work this stone. How to find that water. How to recognize this danger. How to behave with those people. Generation after generation, the human lineage carried both genes and learned behavior forward. Neither was guaranteed. Now imagine 100 years passing. 4 generations, perhaps. For us, 100 years seems substantial. It can separate grandparents from great-grandparents. It can transform cities. It can change technology almost beyond recognition. But within a bottleneck lasting more than 100,000 years, a century is almost nothing. The river valley remains. Or perhaps it does not. The original people are gone. Their descendants may live somewhere else. The names, if names existed in any form, are forgotten. The faces are forgotten, but some habits may remain. A way of breaking stone, a remembered route, a preference for a particular shelter, a pattern of movement linked to seasonal animals. The individual disappears. The behavior continues. 1,000 years pass. Now dozens of generations separate the living from the woman we imagined at the river. No one remembers her. No one remembers anyone who remembered her. If she had discovered something useful, it may have become so ordinary that no one knows it was ever discovered. This is one of the deepest forms of anonymity. To change the future without anyone knowing that the change had a beginning. 10,000 years pass. Now the landscape itself may be different. Climate has shifted. Vegetation has moved. Some animal populations have changed. Rivers have altered their channels. Sediment has buried old surfaces. The place where that woman once stood may no longer resemble the place at all. Perhaps her descendants are hundreds of kilometers away. Perhaps they mixed with other groups. Perhaps some branches of her family vanished. Perhaps one tiny branch continued. If the proposed bottleneck is real, there may still be tens of thousands of years left to endure. This is why the phrase humanity almost disappeared can hide the true scale of the story. There was no single group carrying the future unchanged across 100,000 years. Groups formed, split, merged, moved, vanished. The population was a shifting network of lives. The chain survived not because every branch continued, but because enough branches did. Think of a woven cord. Some fibers break, some end, others overlap, new fibers join. The cord remains intact because the structure is shared. Ancient human populations may have survived in something like this way. One group disappears, but its members had already mixed with another. One region becomes uninhabitable, but people move before conditions become fatal. One lineage ends, but others continue. Survival belongs not to one family, but to a network. And yet the network is made of individuals, people who became hungry, people who became tired, people who feared predators, people who carried children, people who lost companions, people who recovered from injuries, people who looked at unfamiliar hills and chose whether to cross them. The abstraction of population history can make us forget this. A graph might show a line dropping sharply. Population size decreases, then the line remains low. Later the line rises. It is clean, quiet, mathematical. But inside that line are births, deaths, failures, meetings, separations, years of abundance, years of hunger. A population curve is made of lives. There is another reason these generations matter. Evolution works through them, not through centuries, not through epochs, through reproduction. Traits that help survival or reproduction can become more common across generations. Traits that do not may disappear. But evolution has no foresight. It is not moving toward Homo sapiens. It does not know where the story ends. There is no plan for language, cities, agriculture, or science. Each generation exists only because the previous one reproduced successfully enough. The future is invisible. This makes our perspective strange. We know something the people in this story could never know. We know that eventually their distant descendants will become forms of humans very different from them. We know that later, Homo populations will spread across enormous regions. We know Neanderthals will emerge. Denisovans will emerge. Homo sapiens will appear much later. We know that some lineages will meet and exchange genes. We know that one branch will eventually become globally dominant. But none of this was inevitable from the viewpoint of 900,000 years ago. A single bad century in the wrong place could erase a local population. A series of failed connections could isolate groups. A severe climatic phase could close important habitats. There were countless paths toward extinction. Only some paths led forward. And even the people walking those successful paths could not know they were successful. Imagine one more scene. Night has fallen. A small group rests in a sheltered place. Perhaps there is fire. Perhaps only darkness. A child is ill. The child has eaten little. An adult remains close. Maybe food is shared. Maybe water is brought. Maybe the group delays movement for a day. Nothing about the moment looks important on the scale of geology. There is no volcanic eruption. No great migration. No technological revolution. Only care. The child survives. Years later, that child has children. One of those children has another. Eventually, after hundreds of generations, a lineage spreads through a much larger population. We cannot say that this happened exactly as imagined, but something like it must have happened countless times. Every person alive today is the end point of an uninterrupted chain of successful reproduction extending backward through deep time. Not one break, not one generation missing. Every ancestor in that chain survived long enough and reproduced successfully enough for the line to continue. That is mathematically obvious. Emotionally, it is almost impossible to grasp. For hundreds of thousands of years, then millions, the chain never broke. Not through drought, not through cold, not through predators, not through disease, not through migration, not through local extinction, not through every other danger that erased so many other lineages. This does not mean our ancestors were uniquely strong. It means they were successful enough, sometimes because of skill, sometimes cooperation, sometimes geography, sometimes flexibility, sometimes chance, probably all of them together. And this is where luck deserves to return to our story. Modern humans are drawn to narratives of destiny. We like to imagine that intelligence guaranteed our rise, that tool use guaranteed success, that cooperation inevitably produced civilization. But evolution offers no such guarantees. Many intelligent species disappear. Many adaptable populations fail. A good strategy can meet a terrible season. A successful group can encounter a disease it cannot survive. A refuge can dry. A migration can end badly. The lineages that lead to us are not proof that survival was inevitable. They are proof only that survival happened, one generation at a time. Perhaps that is why the anonymous people of deep prehistory deserve a different kind of attention, not admiration in the modern heroic sense. We do not know enough about them for that, but recognition. They occupy almost all of the human story. Written history is a very recent layer. The lives before writing stretch backward through a depth that makes the pyramids seem almost new. Most human ancestors left no personal record, no portrait, no signature, no sentence. Yet their decisions shaped everything that came later. A person who moved into a new valley could alter the geography of future descendants. A group that accepted outsiders could change a genetic lineage. A tool-making technique taught successfully could improve survival. A remembered water source could save children who otherwise might have died. The consequences could echo forward even when the cause was forgotten almost immediately. This is deep history, causation without memory, inheritance without names. And if the bottleneck lasted as long as the FitCoal model suggests, then these invisible acts had to continue for an almost unimaginable number of generations. By the final part of that proposed interval, no living person would have had even the faintest cultural memory of its beginning. The people near 813,000 years ago were separated from those near 930,000 years ago by more time than separates us from the earliest known permanent settlements by many times over. They were not the same communities, not the same landscapes, not the same lives. And yet genetically, a model can connect them as part of one prolonged demographic narrowing. Then, according to that model, something changed. The ancestral effective population began to grow again. Perhaps habitats expanded. Perhaps climatic conditions improved in some regions. Perhaps migration reconnected groups. Perhaps populations became more successful at occupying a wider range of environments. Perhaps several processes worked together. There was no morning when ancient humans woke and discovered that the bottleneck had ended. Population recovery would have been as gradual as population decline. A few more surviving children, a few more successful groups, a wider territory, more contact, more movement, more branches continuing instead of disappearing. Generation after generation, the narrow corridor began to open, and still no one knew. The people living through the recovery did not know they were recovering. They knew only that there was food here, water there, another group beyond the ridge, a child sleeping beside them, another season ahead. The same ordinary concerns that had carried the lineage through the darkest demographic years continued carrying it into something new. The population began to expand. The human family tree widened. And the long evolutionary story moved toward another chapter. Recovery does not always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a few more children surviving, a few more groups remaining connected, a few more valleys staying habitable, a few more journeys ending successfully. If the severe population bottleneck proposed by the FitCoal model was real, then sometime after roughly 813,000 years ago, the long narrowing may have begun to ease. Not suddenly, not everywhere, and not in a way that anyone living at the time could have recognized. There was no announcement, no celebration, no moment when an ancient human looked across the landscape and understood that the danger had passed. The world was still cold at times, still dry in places, still unpredictable. Predators remained, injuries remained, disease remained, water still failed, children still died, groups still disappeared. But somewhere within the larger pattern of survival, the balance may have begun to change. The ancestral population, according to the FitCoal reconstruction, started to increase. The narrow corridor began to widen. Imagine a river after a long drought. For years, it has been reduced to isolated channels between sandbars. Some pools have disappeared entirely. Others barely connect. Then rainfall begins to return more often. At first, the difference is difficult to see. One channel becomes deeper. Another connects to a pool that had been isolated. Vegetation spreads back toward the banks. Animals return in greater numbers. The river is not yet what it once was, but it is moving toward abundance. A population can recover in a similar way. One community grows slightly larger. Another remains stable instead of shrinking. A new territory becomes habitable. Two groups that had been separated begin to meet more frequently. Births outnumber deaths over enough generations. The change accumulates. From the viewpoint of a single lifetime, almost nothing happens. From the viewpoint of 100,000 years, the entire human future can be transformed. What caused that possible recovery? We do not know. And here, uncertainty is unavoidable. The genetic model can suggest that effective population size increased, but it cannot tell us exactly what people were doing on the ground when that increase began. The explanation may involve climate. As environmental conditions shifted, some regions may have become more productive. Rainfall patterns may have improved in certain areas. Habitats may have expanded. Routes that had once been difficult to cross may have reopened. Rivers and lakes may have supported more stable concentrations of plants and animals. A larger amount of usable land can support more people. That seems simple, but population growth is rarely the result of one factor. Mobility may have mattered. Ancient human groups had already demonstrated the ability to move across large distances over many generations. When favorable habitats expanded, populations could move into them. A valley that had once been too dry might become useful. A grassland corridor might reconnect distant regions. A river system might allow movement into territory occupied only intermittently before. New land means new resources. New resources can mean more surviving children. And more surviving children, repeated across generations, means expansion. Social connection may also have played a role. If fragmented groups began encountering one another more often, the benefits could have been substantial. More potential mates. More opportunities for genetic exchange. More information about the landscape. More chances for technologies and learned behaviors to spread. The human population would become not merely larger, but more connected. And connected populations are often more resilient than isolated ones. If one local group experiences hardship, individuals can move. If one resource fails, another region may remain productive. If knowledge is lost in one community, it may persist in another. The network itself becomes a form of protection. This does not require a vast society. It does not require organized trade routes. It does not require anything resembling a nation. Occasional contact can be enough. A meeting every few seasons. A young person joining another group. A movement along the same river corridor. A shared source of stone. A remembered route between water systems. Small connections, repeated across long periods, can transform demographic history. Technology may also have contributed. We should be cautious here. There was no sudden technological revolution at exactly 813,000 years ago. The stone tool traditions of the time had deep roots. Acheulean technologies had already spread across parts of Africa and Eurasia. Large cutting tools, flakes, and other forms of stoneworking had been used for hundreds of thousands of years. But a technology does not need to be new to be important. Reliability matters. A group that consistently produces effective cutting edges has an advantage. A group that knows where suitable stone can be found has an advantage. A group that passes those skills from older to younger individuals protects that advantage across generations. The same is true of fire. Evidence for fire use in this broad period remains complex, and habitual control was not necessarily universal. But where people could reliably maintain or use fire, it may have opened opportunities. Cooking can make some foods easier to digest. Heat can reduce cold stress. Light can extend social activity into darkness. Fire can change how people occupy a place. Even small gains in energy, protection, or social coordination can matter when multiplied across generations. Dietary flexibility may have been equally important. A population that can use a wider range of foods is less vulnerable to the disappearance of any single resource. Plants, roots, seeds, meat, marrow, small animals, aquatic foods in suitable environments. The exact balance would vary by region. The larger principle is adaptability. When the environment changes, specialists can struggle. Generalists have more options. The genus Homo appears repeatedly in prehistory as an unusually flexible kind of primate, not adapted to only one narrow ecological setting, not confined to one type of landscape. Populations of Homo lived in different climates, at different elevations, and across widely separated regions. That flexibility may have helped the ancestral population expand when opportunities returned. But perhaps the most important transformation was not any single technology or food. It was the accumulation of many small advantages at once. A slightly more reliable water strategy, a slightly broader diet, a slightly larger social network, a slightly more effective way of making tools, a slightly better understanding of seasonal movement, a slightly greater ability to care for dependent children. No one of these changes creates a dramatic moment. Together, they shift the odds, and evolution is often the story of odds shifting. Imagine a group of 30 people. During a difficult period, perhaps only enough children survive to keep the population stable. Then conditions improve. Food becomes more dependable. Contact with another group introduces new partners. More children survive. The group becomes 40, then 50. Some members leave and establish themselves elsewhere. A new group forms. Years later, another splits. Soon there are several connected communities where once there was one. Nothing has exploded. Nothing has transformed overnight. But the demographic structure is different. There are more chances for survival, more branches in the tree. This is how a population can begin to escape a bottleneck, not through one heroic event, through multiplication. And once expansion begins, it can create its own momentum. More people occupy more territory. More territory produces more opportunities. More groups mean more possible connections. More connections mean genetic exchange and information flow. A population that once existed as scattered points can begin to resemble a web. The web is still fragile, but it is harder to erase. Now return to the image of a tree. Below the bottleneck, the trunk is broad. Then it narrows. For a long distance, the tree seems vulnerable. One more wound might have ended it. But above the narrow place, the trunk begins to thicken again. Branches appear, not all at once, not neatly. Some split, some die, some cross. Some merge in ways that a simple drawing cannot show. That is closer to the true shape of human evolution, a branching network, not a straight ladder. After the period associated with the proposed bottleneck, the evolutionary history of Homo continued to become increasingly complex. Populations in Africa and Eurasia diverged. Some groups became isolated for long periods. Others may have exchanged genes. Morphological differences accumulated. Lineages emerged that would later contribute to the ancestry of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and eventually Homo sapiens. But we must be careful with the sequence. It would be tempting to say that the bottleneck created these later humans, that it was a turning point that directly produced our species. The evidence does not allow such a simple conclusion. Human evolution rarely offers clean cause and effect at this scale. The timing of ancient population splits is difficult to reconstruct precisely. Different genetic models produce different estimates. Fossil classifications are debated. Ancient populations did not obey the species categories that modern researchers use to organize them, and the proposed bottleneck itself remains disputed. So, we should not imagine 813,000 years ago as the birth of modern humanity. It was not. Homo sapiens would appear far later. Neanderthals and Denisovans would also emerge from later evolutionary histories. The value of the bottleneck hypothesis lies somewhere else. If a deep ancestral contraction really occurred, then later branches of the human family grew from a lineage that had already passed through an extraordinary narrowing. That possibility changes how we look at everything above it. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens. Other lineages we know only through fragments, perhaps others we have not yet discovered, all emerging after a period when ancestral genetic diversity may have been sharply reduced. It is an unsettling image, a vast future growing from a narrow past. Consider the Neanderthals. Hundreds of thousands of years after the possible bottleneck began to ease, Neanderthal populations would occupy large parts of Europe and Western Asia. They would adapt to difficult climates. They would make sophisticated tools. They would hunt large animals. They would use fire. They would care for injured individuals. They would leave behind evidence of behavior more complex than earlier stereotypes allowed. Then there were the Denisovans. For most of modern scientific history, no one knew they had existed. Their presence was revealed in the 21st century through genetic evidence from small fossil remains. A finger bone, teeth, later discoveries. From these fragments emerged the existence of a human population that had contributed ancestry to people alive today. The Denisovans are a reminder of how much can remain hidden. An entire human lineage can disappear from visible history while leaving traces in DNA. And then, much later, Homo sapiens appeared in Africa. Our species was not the inevitable destination of everything that came before. We were one more branch. For a time, we shared the planet with other human lineages. We met some of them. We interbred with some of them. Neanderthal ancestry remains in many people today. Denisovan ancestry remains particularly significant in some populations. The human family tree is not simply a series of replacements. It is also a history of contact. And this makes the ancient population recovery even more interesting. Because population growth does more than increase numbers. It creates possibilities for branching. A small population has fewer opportunities to spread across different environments and remain separated long enough to diverge. A larger expanding population can occupy new regions. Geography separates groups. Climate separates them further. Time accumulates differences. Then sometimes those groups meet again. Expansion creates complexity. Imagine a small ancestral network beginning to spread across a broad landscape. One branch moves toward a highland region. Another follows a river. Another remains near a lake basin. Over thousands of years, the groups experience different environments, different prey, different climates, different neighboring populations. Their genes drift. Their bodies change. Their learned traditions change. No one notices the divergence. Every individual still experiences only ordinary life. But deep time separates what was once connected. Later, new movements may bring descendants back into contact. They meet as populations that have changed. Sometimes they mix. Sometimes one disappears. Sometimes both continue. This pattern repeats again and again across the human story. Expansion, separation, adaptation, contact, mixture, loss. The possible bottleneck of around 900,000 years ago is only one part of this immense process. A dramatic part, if the estimate is correct, but still only a part. And perhaps that is why the story is more powerful when we resist turning it into a miracle. There was no moment when evolution chose us. No hidden force guaranteed that the human branch would survive. The population may simply have moved from a period of extreme vulnerability into a period of greater opportunity. The odds improved. That was enough. More people survived. More territories became occupied. More branches continued. And over hundreds of thousands of years, those branches produced a diversity of humans that would have seemed unimaginable to the small communities near the beginning of the story. Now picture the landscape again. A river valley. A group walking along the bank. There are more signs of other humans than before. Old stone flakes. Tracks. A recently abandoned sleeping place. Perhaps a distant fire. Perhaps voices carried by wind. The people are no longer quite as isolated. Farther along the river is another group. Beyond the hills, another. Some will meet. Some will avoid one another. Some individuals will cross between them. Children will be born carrying ancestry from both. The network expands. The future becomes less narrow. The ancient people do not know this. They have no concept of population recovery. They do not know that a geneticist, hundreds of thousands of years later, may reconstruct a rising line from the DNA of their descendants. They only know that the land here contains water, that animals pass this way, that the stone is good, that the children are hungry, that another group is nearby, that tomorrow requires another decision. The scale of history changes only when we look backward. To them there is one day. To us there are 100,000 years. To them one child survives. To us an ancestral population grows. To them a group moves beyond a ridge. To us human range expands. To them 2 communities meet beside a river. To us genetic lineages reconnect. This distance between lived experience and historical consequence is one of the great mysteries of deep time. The people who change the future never knew that they were changing it. They simply continued, and eventually the narrow ancestral corridor opened into a far larger human world. Hundreds of thousands of years later, one branch would become Homo sapiens. Much later still, Homo sapiens would spread across nearly every habitable region of Earth. Cities would rise. Languages would multiply. Ships would cross oceans. Writing would preserve memory outside the human mind. Machines would fly. Humans would walk on the moon. And scientists would learn to read the genome well enough to ask whether, far beneath all of that complexity, there had once been a time when the ancestral tree nearly became too narrow to continue. The answer is still uncertain. But whether the bottleneck was as extreme as FitCoal suggests, or whether future research reveals a more complicated demographic history, one fact remains. The human story passed through populations far smaller and more vulnerable than the civilization that exists today. Our enormous modern numbers can make that difficult to feel. 8 billion people make humanity seem permanent. The lights of cities make us seem secure. Our technology makes us feel separate from the forces that shaped earlier humans. But every branch above us depends on the branches below. And somewhere in the deep past, those branches were thin. They survived. They expanded. They divided. They met again. And eventually, one of them led here. To the person listening now. To a world filled with billions of descendants of ancient survivors. A world so crowded with human beings that it is almost impossible to imagine how sparse our ancestry may once have been. And that is where the final part of our journey begins. Not beside a Pleistocene lake, not beneath a prehistoric sky, but here, in the present, where the descendants of those vanished generations look backward and ask at what their survival means. Look outside at a city at night. Thousands of windows, headlights moving along roads, trains crossing bridges, aircraft blinking slowly above the horizon. Inside apartments, houses, hospitals, hotels, and quiet bedrooms, millions of people are eating, speaking, working, dreaming, and sleeping. Far above them, satellites move silently through darkness. Beneath them, cables carry information across continents and oceans. Water travels through pipes. Food moves through global networks. Electricity arrives at the touch of a switch. For most people alive today, another human being is rarely very far away. Humanity has become one of the most widespread large mammals on Earth. We live in deserts, on islands, in high mountains, near polar ice, along tropical rivers, across enormous plains. More than 8 billion of us now occupy a planet that, less than 1 million years ago, may have contained ancestral human populations so small that their genetic future passed through an extraordinary narrowing. The contrast is almost impossible to absorb. From scattered communities searching for water beneath Pleistocene skies, to cities containing millions, from a sharp stone held in one hand, to machines capable of leaving the atmosphere, from information stored only in living memory, to libraries containing billions of words, and perhaps, beneath all of it, a faint genetic echo of a time when continuation was far less certain. If the severe bottleneck proposed by the FitCoal study truly occurred, then the human story contains a remarkable paradox. Our civilization is vast, but part of our ancestry may have passed through something extremely small. Every highway, every language, every family photograph, every piece of music, every scientific instrument, every building illuminated tonight, ultimately depends upon an unbroken chain of reproduction extending backward through those ancient generations. Not because they were trying to build our world. They could not imagine it. They were simply living theirs. This distinction matters. It is easy, looking backward, to turn evolution into destiny. We know the ending, so everything before it begins to look like preparation. A stone tool seems like the beginning of technology. A controlled fire seems like the beginning of civilization. Migration seems like the beginning of global expansion. Cooperation seems like the beginning of society. But none of those ancient behaviors existed in order to produce us. Evolution does not plan. It does not see the future. It does not preserve a lineage because that lineage will one day compose symphonies or build telescopes. At every stage, survival is local, immediate, contingent. The person searching for water is trying to find water. The person shaping stone is trying to make a useful edge. The adult carrying an injured child is responding to the needs of that child. The group crossing a valley is looking for a place where life can continue. We assign historical importance afterward. They experienced only the day before them. And perhaps this is the first lesson hidden inside the near-extinction hypothesis. Large outcomes can emerge from very small actions. If ancestral populations were dangerously reduced, then survival probably did not depend upon one secret adaptation. There was no single answer. No one behavior that guaranteed continuation. Instead, survival may have come from a combination of traits and circumstances. Mobility, dietary flexibility, knowledge of water, stone technology, fire where it could be controlled, social learning, cooperation, care, connections between groups, successful reproduction, ecological refuges, and chance. Each one changes the odds slightly. Together, across thousands of generations, they can determine whether a lineage disappears or continues. Consider water again. Perhaps one community survived because it knew a spring that persisted through dry seasons. That sounds almost trivial, but a reliable spring can support children. Children become adults. Adults move. Some meet people from another group. Genes pass onward. Thousands of years later, none of the descendants remember the spring. The spring may no longer exist. The valley may have changed completely. But the consequence remains. Or imagine a group leaving a drying region before conditions became fatal. No one knows whether the decision was deliberate in the way we understand planning. Perhaps animals moved and people followed. Perhaps remembered routes drew them elsewhere. Perhaps contact with another group revealed a better landscape. Whatever the reason, mobility can turn ecological collapse into migration. A population survives not by defeating the changing environment, but by moving beyond it. Now imagine another community that does not move. The local water fails. Children weaken. Adults travel farther. A few deaths reduce the group's ability to forage and protect itself. Eventually, the community disappears. No one living today descends from that particular local population. Its experience leaves little or nothing in our genomes. Its tools may lie undiscovered beneath sediment. Its dead may never fossilize. Its existence passes almost completely out of history. This happened to countless populations. The survival of our ancestral line should never make us forget how much was lost. Human evolution contains many dead ends. Populations emerged and vanished. Species appeared and disappeared. Some lineages contributed genes to later humans. Others did not. Some are represented by rich fossil collections, others by fragments. Others, perhaps, have left no evidence yet recognized by science. The human family tree we know today is almost certainly incomplete, and even the branches we can see are difficult to arrange. A skull can challenge an old classification. A tooth can shift the known range of a population. A few fragments of ancient DNA can reveal an entire group no one knew existed. This is why the story of the proposed bottleneck must remain open. The 2023 FitCoal analysis offered one striking reconstruction: a deep population decline. An effective breeding population averaging around 1,280 individuals. A bottleneck extending from roughly 930,000 to 813,000 years ago. It is a powerful result, but it is still an inference. Later genetic work using a different method, FLASH, found much less support for such an extreme collapse. By 2026, researchers continued debating the models and assumptions behind these reconstructions. The disagreement has not erased the mystery. It has sharpened it. What exactly are modern genomes remembering? A genuine near extinction? A severe demographic contraction? A complex arrangement of ancient populations that were separated and later reconnected? Some combination of all three? We do not yet know. And that is not a failure of science. It is science working at the limits of what can be recovered from deep time. Imagine trying to reconstruct an enormous landscape from a handful of footprints. One print tells you that someone walked there. Another suggests direction. A third is partially erased. Rain has removed the rest. You can build hypotheses. Some will fit better than others. Then another footprint is found. The picture changes. Genetics works with much more information than a few footprints, but the basic challenge remains. The past is incomplete. Researchers create models. Models make predictions. Other researchers test them. Methods improve. Assumptions are challenged. New fossils appear. New genomes are sequenced. The story changes. That is not uncertainty to be feared. It is uncertainty made useful. Perhaps one day an ancient genome from a fossil near this critical period will survive well enough to be sequenced. Perhaps several will. Perhaps they will support the severe bottleneck. Perhaps they will reveal that ancient populations were more structured than current models assume. Perhaps the dates will move. Perhaps the estimated population size will rise or fall. Perhaps the entire narrative will become more complicated. Human origins almost always become more complicated when new evidence arrives. But even if the most dramatic version of the bottleneck is eventually revised, the larger lesson remains. Our ancestry was never guaranteed. Small populations are fragile. Habitats change. Species disappear. Evolution does not protect the future. The fact that we are here is evidence not of inevitability, but of continuity. One generation connected to another, then another, then another. Every person alive today belongs to such a chain. Think about what that means. Your ancestry passes backward beyond every country that currently exists, beyond every modern language, beyond every religious tradition, beyond every empire, beyond writing, beyond agriculture, beyond permanent villages, beyond Homo sapiens itself. The chain continues into populations whose faces we cannot reconstruct with certainty, into people who lived in landscapes that no longer exist, into climates without modern equivalents, into groups that never knew the world contained continents. And still the chain continues. One parent to one child. Again, again, again. There is something almost meditative in the simplicity of it. Civilization feels complex. Ancestry is simple. Someone lived. Someone reproduced. A child survived. Then the process repeated. For us to exist, that chain cannot contain a final break. Local branches broke constantly, but the branch leading to the present continued. That continuation required biology, behavior, ecology, and chance to align often enough. Not perfectly. Only often enough. Perhaps this is why cooperation matters so deeply in the story. We often celebrate human intelligence as though the brain alone explains our survival. But a highly intelligent individual abandoned in a hostile landscape remains vulnerable. Human beings survive through others. Food can be shared. Knowledge can be taught. Children can be cared for. Injury can be survived. Routes can be remembered collectively. Groups can exchange members. Information can move farther than any one person. The human advantage may never have been simply intelligence inside one skull. It may have been intelligence distributed through relationships, a network of minds, a network of hands, a network of memory. If the population became very small, those networks would have been especially precious. Each connection increased resilience. Each meeting between groups could open possibilities. Each child carried not only genes but learned behavior. Each older person could hold memories of places younger people had never seen. Culture, even in its earliest forms, allowed experience to survive beyond the individual. And then there was luck. We should leave room for it. Perhaps rainfall arrived at the right moment. Perhaps a river remained flowing for one more season. Perhaps a group turned east instead of west. Perhaps two communities happened to meet. Perhaps a disease passed around one valley and spared another. There is no shame in placing chance inside evolution. Chance has always been there. Mutations occur without knowing what the future requires. Climate shifts without regard for the species living beneath it. Accidents happen. Storms choose no victims. The history of life is not a contest judged by fairness. It is a vast sequence of conditions, responses, probabilities, and outcomes. Our lineage happened to continue. Many did not. So when we call ourselves descendants of survivors, we should not mean that our ancestors were invincible. Quite the opposite. They were vulnerable. Their survival matters because failure was possible. Now return one final time to the world near 900,000 years ago. The sun has gone down. The landscape is losing color. A narrow band of light remains along the horizon. Somewhere, perhaps near water, a small group has stopped moving for the night. Maybe a fire burns. We cannot know whether this particular group controlled fire reliably. But let us imagine that tonight they do. The flame is small. It does not conquer the darkness. It only pushes it back a short distance. Beyond the light are insects, animals, wind moving through grass, the sounds of a living Pleistocene night. Several people sit close together. Perhaps someone works on stone. Perhaps someone eats. Perhaps someone is already asleep. A child lies near an adult. The child knows nothing about extinction, nothing about genetics, nothing about humanity. The child does not know the name of the planet, does not know that Earth travels around the sun, does not know that stars are distant suns, does not know that time extends backward billions of years. There is no concept of a future civilization, no pyramids, no Rome, no printing press, no electricity, no moon landing, no genome sequencing. No one around that fire can imagine that almost 1 million years later, another human might lie awake at night, listening to a story about them. For the child, the universe is immediate. Warmth, darkness, familiar bodies, a voice nearby, perhaps hunger, perhaps safety, perhaps fear, and tomorrow. That is enough. Maybe this imagined child belongs to a lineage that reaches the present. Maybe not. There is no way to know. Perhaps the entire group disappears several generations later. Perhaps one person eventually joins another community. Perhaps descendants move hundreds of kilometers. Perhaps their ancestry becomes part of populations that later spread widely. The names are gone. The details are gone. Almost everything is gone. And yet somewhere, somehow, enough lines continued. Across droughts, across cold periods, across changing rivers, across local extinctions, across separation, across reunion, across thousands upon thousands of generations, until much later, Homo sapiens appeared. Then our species spread, met other humans, mixed with some of them, survived crises of its own, crossed coastlines, reached islands, entered cold northern landscapes, built shelters, created art, buried the dead, developed agriculture, built towns, built cities, invented writing, recorded history, forgot almost everything that came before, and then, remarkably, began to recover fragments of that forgotten past, from stone, from bone, from sediment, from climate records, and finally from DNA. We became the first humans able to ask how close our own ancestral line might once have come to disappearing. We still do not know the exact answer. Perhaps the bottleneck was truly as severe as the most dramatic model suggests. Perhaps future evidence will soften it. Perhaps the real story was stranger than either side of the current debate imagines. But uncertainty does not diminish the wonder, because the deepest fact remains unchanged. There was no promise that we would be here. No law of nature required the human story to continue. The pyramids were not guaranteed. Cities were not guaranteed. Books were not guaranteed. Science was not guaranteed. A spacecraft crossing the darkness between Earth and the Moon was not waiting at the end of evolution. All of it depended upon a chain that could have broken. Again and again it did not. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about human history. Not that we learned to shape stone. Not that we learned to control fire. Not that we crossed continents. Not that we built civilizations. Not even that we eventually reached beyond our planet. The strangest thing may be much simpler. After all the changing climates, all the vanished populations, all the failed migrations, all the diseases, all the droughts, all the children who did not survive, all the lineages that ended, all the moments when the future narrowed, we are still here. Tonight, somewhere on Earth, a child is sleeping. Around that child is a world unimaginable to our distant ancestors. Electric light, medicine, written language, machines, a civilization containing billions of people, and inside that sleeping child is DNA carried forward through an uninterrupted chain of ancestors stretching into a darkness far deeper than history. Perhaps hidden within that DNA is the faint signature of a population that once became frighteningly small. Perhaps future science will tell the story differently. But whatever the final answer may be, those ancient generations remain beneath us, not as ghosts, not as legends, but as ancestry, a silent foundation beneath everything we have become. And so, when we imagine that small light in the Pleistocene darkness, we do not need to know the names of the people gathered around it. We do not need to turn them into heroes. It is enough to understand what they did. They lived. They cared for one another. They adapted. They moved. They endured. They raised another generation. And then they disappeared into time. But the chain continued, all the way to us. And tonight, as the modern world grows quiet, perhaps there is comfort in remembering that our history did not begin with kings, monuments, or written words. It began much earlier, beside water, across open land, under unfamiliar stars, among small communities for whom tomorrow was never guaranteed. And after almost 1 million years, their tomorrow has become our today. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of tonight's journey here on Calm History Nights. If this quiet walk through the distant past helped you relax, reflect, or drift a little closer to sleep, we are truly grateful you were here. You can support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who also enjoys slow, thoughtful history. Your support helps us continue creating long-form stories that bring the forgotten worlds of the past back to life. Until our next journey, rest well, sleep peacefully, and let history keep you company through the night.